Hello everyone, this is Peter, and this is the Iran-Contra affair. Yeah. So, from 1953 to 1979, Iran was governed by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. It's not really important how you spell his name as far as I'm concerned, but, so just go for it. The government had become increasingly friendly to the U.S. and the West, which angered many Iranians. And so they began rioting in 1978, and in 1979 the Shah, who is this guy in the bottom right corner, was forced into exile. And the previously secular government was replaced with an Islamic one, who immediately adopted an anti-American policy. And then, the U.S. wants to improve the relations with the new Iranian government to allow for better oil trade. So they gave us a bunch of oil, which is nice. And at that time, official U.S. policy banned weapons sales to Iran, who were in the middle of a war with Iraq. And so the National Security Council, or NSC, was trying to get better relations with the country. And there were 7 American hostages after the big Iran hostage crisis. So another 7 American hostages were taken by Iranian groups in Lebanon. And the Iranian government offered to buy missiles from the U.S. in exchange for releasing some of the hostages. And so Reagan's national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, agrees to the deal and informs Reagan in August of 1985, who also agrees. And although the initial agreement was to sell 100 TOW or TOW missiles for most or all of the hostages, the U.S. ultimately sold 500 missiles in exchange for the first hostage. And here's a picture of one being shot right here. So they're not like super giant nukes or anything, they're just kind of little missiles, but they probably make still a big explosion. And the way they did this was the U.S. would send the missiles to the Israelis, who would then send them to Iran, so it wouldn't be so obvious. And then they got the money back to the U.S. through a little system they had or something, I don't know. And so, over time, the program expands, and the U.S. ultimately ends up selling 2,000 TOW missiles, 150 Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, 200 Sidewinder missiles, 40 Phoenix missiles, and a partridge in a pear tree in exchange for several $1 million, and the release of only 2 American hostages. And then so over in Nicaragua, there had been a socialist revolution in 1979, which left a new government, the Sandinistas, in charge. And despite U.S. aid to try and make friends with the Sandinistas, they ended up allying themselves with the Soviet Union and Cuba. So President Reagan cut off further aid to the government. And around that time, several counter-revolutionary groups, who were altogether known as Contras, formed to fight against the new government. And the largest of these was the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or FDN, which is rearranged because it's Spanish. And then the Reagan administration began funding these groups instead. And so the Contras have been accused of numerous human rights violations, including like murdering and raping civilians and executing people who were known to have aided the Sandinistas without any trial. But the Sandinistas were also accused of this, so there's kind of debate over what was going on. There's not really evidence for either side. And also, there's some speculation, if you see this top right picture here, that the Contras were getting money by selling crack cocaine in Los Angeles, which ended up being a problem there. And there's some more Sandinistas down in the bottom. One of them has an afro over the left. And, yeah. And because of these violations, as well as the discovery that the CIA had been placing mines in a Nicaraguan harbor, Congress passed the Boland Amendments, which banned aid to the Contras. Despite this, President Reagan felt the need to continue supporting the democratic revolution, which he felt was similar to our own against the British. And several methods were used to get around these amendments. The most publicized occurred in 1986 when Colonel Oliver North, who was a member of the NSC, decided to divert $12 million that they had gained from the sale of missiles to Iran to the Contran groups. And by the time the diversion was discovered, the Contras had only received about $600,000. And so this was all discovered when 2 Lebanese newspapers reported about the U.S. selling missiles to Iran on November 3rd of 1986, and the rest of the affair was discovered shortly thereafter. During the next month, President Reagan was obviously asked about it a lot, and he gave conflicting statements over his knowledge of it and the U.S. policy towards these countries. And on November 26th, Reagan appoints John Tower to the Tower Commission to investigate the NSC's actions. And they determined that the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, which is spelled like Reagan but without an A, or without a first A, and National Security Advisor Admiral John Poindexter were to blame for what had happened. They also said that Reagan should have been more aware of what was going on. He later appointed an independent counsel, former judge, his last name was Walsh, to investigate the actions also, and ended up charging several people with various crimes. And none of these people were actually really I don't think any of them ever went to jail, because the majority of them were either overturned in appeals courts or pardoned by the first President Bush, who came right after Reagan. And so the actual Iran-Contra hearings began on March 5th, 1987, and lasted for 41 days, where Oliver North, Admiral Poindexter, and several other people testified about what had been going on to Congress. And they ultimately determined that Reagan was overall responsible because he should have known what had been going on in his own government, regardless of whether or not he was responsible. He knew about it. But yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing. We sold missiles to Iran. Iran gave us money. We gave it to Nicaraguans. It's a good time. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.